thank you for joining us in the Automaker Supplier Relationship session at CAR MBS 2020. This afternoon session is sponsored by Warner, Norcross, and Judd. During the session, all audience members will be muted to ensure a quality user experience for everyone participating. Please submit your questions by using the Q&A function. If you have any other questions regarding the virtual MBS experience, please feel free to ask those questions at the information desk in the virtual lobby. Please also take a moment to visit the virtual exhibits in the exhibit hall. And if you would like to earn CEU or PDH credits for participating in CAR MBS, please visit our MBS page on our website at www.cargroup.org to access the registration link for CEUs or PDHs. Once again, thank you for joining us today. I'm pleased to welcome Session Moderator, Director, Automotive Communities Partnership, and Assistant Director, Business Research, Center for Automotive Research, Nard Zwicky.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Supplier Relations panel of MBS 2020. It's a new paradigm. You know, it's a very different MBS. We're no longer at the Grand Traverse Resort with 1,000 of our best friends. We're scattered, around North America and beyond for this panel. But we're grateful to you for making the time to join us today. And I can tell you, in this environment, the environment that we're in actually really fuels a lot of the substance of this conversation that we're about to have, because it's really taken us into some new uncharted territory that, one, the day-to-day operations of the automotive industry don't really prepare us for, two, that other crises we faced really haven't prepared us for as well. And so to have that conversation, I'm pleased to welcome Shilpan Amin from General Motors and Kathy Worthen from Yazaki. And we're going to be discussing what the situation currently is and hopefully get some real insights on what it means for automaker supplier relations, because it's not just COVID, right? We were already coming down off a global peak of sales, which we achieved in 2016. All of this is happening in an environment as the industry transforms for automated vehicles, electrified vehicles, and a whole lot of other trends. So taken together, it's a heck of a time to have the roles that these folks do in their companies. And I can't wait to hear from them about what their experiences have been like and what they expect for the future. So with that, Shilpan, why don't we kick it to you first? Each of our panelists will make some introductory comments on their own, and we're going to spend the bulk of our time on the question and answer portion. We've got some great questions to start us off, but we'd really like to invite the members of our audience to submit their own questions. You can find a Q&A button on the very bottom of your screen, and we'd appreciate it if you could help us fuel this conversation as we go. And to our panelists, I'd like to encourage you, regardless of to whom the question is asked, if you'd like to chime in with your own thoughts and observations, sometimes these conversational parts of the panel are really where the viewers get the most content. So we'd like to encourage that as well. So without further ado, Shilpan, why don't I kick it to you to get us started?
Thanks, Bernard, and I'm super excited actually to be on the panel with Kathy Worthen, as we've worked very closely together over the years. And from my standpoint, as we've gone through the COVID situation, it's actually been unprecedented with what we've faced as an industry and as within General Motors. There hasn't been a crisis ever in our history like this, from the beginnings when we were monitoring the situation in China and seeing it spread into Korea and Japan and understanding what it meant to our value chain, all the way through as it spread into Europe and into the US, and currently still a situation within the US and obviously growing in Mexico and Brazil. And on top of that, you start seeing some of the second wave impacts in countries around the world. And we buy material, from all of these locations that are facing the crisis. I would say two important points for us. One, when you talk about supplier relations and building that trust and collaboration, it's been key for us to move forward, and not only to ensure continued operations, and I'm happy to say we've had very few impacts to our production facilities based on our suppliers' ability to identify parts, working with engineering to identify alternatives, or finding a creative solution to keep production running. But then even when we started having the impact, especially here in the US, and the stay-at-home orders came in place and we had to shut down all of our operations, it was incredible to watch our industry come together and talk about what it takes to restart. How do we keep safety as our most important factor? And you saw elements of removing the competitiveness and putting back in the collaboration across suppliers, across the industry, whether it was sharing our safety playbooks, putting in, how do you procure personal protection equipment. We actually shared our mask production and mask bill of design out to the suppliers and out to a broader industry. So we knew there was going to be limited capacity on masks, and we wanted to make sure everyone can prepare to put all the safety protocols back to ensure when the industry does start back up, we can demonstrate that safety is at the center of how we run our operations. And I'm happy to say, to date, with the protocols put in place, there's been zero spread of the COVID within our facility. So we actually believe people are more safe in our facilities than they are in the general public. Beyond that, the most amazing part of this is to sit back and watch how collectively as an industry, when the nation had called for help, we all jumped on board to find solutions in providing those critical care needs, whether it was ventilator production or ramping up capacity of personal protection equipment in incredible timeframes, really stemming from how strong that trust and collaboration is, how creative we are as an industry to find solutions on production, and knowing that there was no other answer than just get it done. And what you found is no one else could do it around the world other than what we have accomplished as an automotive industry. And, very proudly on how General Motors led the ventilator production. It had demonstrated, others have tried, no one can do it as the automotive industry does. And so we should all be proud about the efforts that help save lives for keeping our community safe. And as an industry, how we all stepped up when the country needed us most.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Shilpan. Yeah, your comments right now, really made me think of the World War II arsenal of democracy effort. And then that very sort of similar ramp up where, you put aside the idea of this company may be my competitor. You put aside maybe the idea of your day-to-day operations or profit focus, and you really sort of come together for the common good. So we had a few thousand modern day Rosie the Riveters out there doing this noble work. With that, Kathy, why don't we turn it over to you for some of your introductory comments before taking some questions.
Great, thank you, Bernard. And just like Shilpan, I'm glad that you allowed us the opportunity to be a part of this today. This is such a critical topic, and as you had mentioned, when you think about 2020, this isn't what we expected to go into for 2020. But as a global company, what we started to recognize early in the year is that this ripple effect of the COVID-19 and how it was impacting our supply chain, we gradually saw, what did we need to do different? How did we evaluate our business condition and our business continuity plans? So when you think about really, again, how you entered into this and when it really became impactful, what were those core priorities that we looked to really rationalize and understand better? Safety became a core priority. When we got to the point where we had to start working from home, were people prepared? Did they have what they needed to do their job? This is all as we're balancing production needs. Can we keep our manufacturing plants running? We have parts coming from around the globe. Assessing that inventory. Do we have enough inventory to continue to meet our customers' needs? Our engagement with our supply base on how they're being impacted. And as Shilpan said, what are those alternatives and how quickly can we act on those alternatives? And when we talk about the topic today of what is that supplier relationship and what is that OE relationship, just how collaborative the industry has been on identifying alternatives, suppliers stepping in to help other suppliers. What is that proactive planning that we're putting in place? And I've really seen this really strong collaboration to get through this. And as we try to work to what is the new normal, what do we need to do different? But as a company, it also required us to take a step back and take a look at our business operations. Where do we need to look at doing things different? Where do we look at more of a business continuity plan as this ripples across the globe? Mexico is a key area for us. We have our manufacturing, a lot of manufacturing in Mexico. So we continue to watch, all of these areas closely. So what is that business model evaluation? And again, how do you work with your supply base to ensure that you can maintain that continuity of production? Thinking through what we proactively do, as I'd mentioned, our dialogue with our supply base has been very strong. We work proactively on checklists that were actually shared from the OEs to make sure we're all, doing a ramp up that is pretty comparable, and making sure that the expectations of the OEs is really what we're following through with. As a supplier, we want to provide confidence to our customers, but also manage our supply base. So we work on that short-term and long-term plan, and really what does that stabilization look like? When you think through, how do you optimize through all of this? We've actually, like I had mentioned, looked at our business structure and where do we need to find improvements? Where do we see risk in logistics in that end-to-end supply chain? We've actually, through this time, invested into some additional tools to manage that end-to-end supply chain, because we need to ensure that we're proactive. We need to ensure that we have the most, efficient type of tools to support our teams as they're in these new environments. Also ensuring that we have the safety of our plant personnel. Day to day, we continue to hear from our suppliers, just as recent as last Friday, they had to clear out midday because somebody had COVID. We were looking for that production. How do we manage through some of those constraints and those crises? Again, just the other day, and again, these are things that pop up that, again, good discussion because we're managing through it, is can't find a logistics provider. In that area of the world, it just wasn't available, and just trying to hand carry parts because we're trying to manage, through this situation. So from a standpoint of working through this time of crisis, it's really important to have these strong relationships and to ensure that we're quick to react to alternatives, that we're quick to react to what our suppliers are looking for, and really, having that all-in discussion. This is tough from a financial standpoint, and I'll say this more times than not, our supply base will say, we're in this together. Yes, I have inventory that we didn't need because production changed. We're in this together. We're not going to, maybe have those same kind of financial discussions that we had in the past. The critical discussions of making sure that we're up on accounts payable. So again, a lot of good collaborative discussion. And again, look forward to the dialogue here, because I think this is critical for us to maintain that communication.
No, thanks very much, Kathy. Great comments, and I think that they're a fantastic intro to the first question I'd like to discuss. And Shilpan, maybe we'll start with you before throwing it back to Kathy. But how is this crisis different? When I think back to the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, that was an immense challenge for folks in this role. Later on, we had things like the 2011 tsunami in Japan, right? But those were, either more isolated or more temporary. In this environment, one, how is this different? Two, how is that changing the way that automakers and suppliers have to work with each other?
Yeah, if someone would have asked our team back in March, really back in February, that, we need to plan for something that will impact the global supply chain, suppliers' ability to produce and your ability to move material, and it will affect the entire world randomly, and you'll have no control of when locations aren't able to produce and when they can restart, or the capacity, their ability to run. And by the way, you're going to have to manage this for 6 months. It would have been easy to give up and say, that's just, beyond impossible. I think one of the things that we've learned through all the crises that we've managed, and, it is completely different, because our first step has always been get boots on the ground, assess the situation, understand how long the gap is. When you run out of parts, and then you have a great assessment of when will that facility be up and running, or when will the next best alternative location be up and running? And that's what we call our white space into. Now that's the gap we have to address. this didn't have a restart date. This didn't have that next time frame of what is that gap you're trying to figure out. So we looked at it from a day by day, week by week, and a month by month outlook of what do we know now, what must be true for us to ensure we have continued operations, and how do we divide that work up so everyone can go make those promises true to ensure continued operations. And again, as I mentioned, that's where the power of teamwork and the ability to demonstrate the potential of an organization comes out, because people find creative solutions. And when you break it up to elements that can be solved, we end up solving those issues. And, you know, I always say we've been able to demonstrate that we can do things beyond what we believe we could be doing. And so don't get stuck on the issue at hand and frame it up how big the issue may be. Because again, if we framed up this issue back in February, I think many of us would have thrown in the towel.
Got it. Oh, thanks very much. So Kathy, can you give us a little bit of perspective on what that looks like from the supplier point of view?
Yeah, from my side, you know, that white space that Shilpan mentioned, it keeps moving. And when you think you understand that roadmap, as Shilpan mentioned, this doesn't have a start and a finish. And that white space does continue to move. We're monitoring where the hot spots are, but in many cases where we're seeing issues aren't even where those hot spots are. So you can put all this planning in place thinking it's migrating around the globe, and then something will pop up, like I just mentioned last week, a region of the world to where we see really very low COVID-19 and pops up and they have to evacuate the location. So again, very unique from what we have ever seen before. And how do you react to that? And what are your contingency plans? So you're typically very focused on knowing what's in front of you and what contingency you need to put in place and what alternatives you need to work. But in this case, a complete surprise on something that we thought, or we would have put in a more safe category. So that's what makes this scenario much more unique. And, you know, as Shilpan mentioned, you know, this is a day-to-day, hour-to-hour. These things come up and you're reacting. So that visibility of that supply chain, knowing what you have in inventory, what are the risks that we have from a supply standpoint, it is literally hour to hour.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Kathy, as you were speaking, it occurred to me this is a great opportunity to tie this subject into a panel that Kristen ran earlier this morning on trade, because as these measures that you just talked about and this visibility and the need to move things around the world transpires, how much is that made harder by the currently dynamic and fairly uncertain trade environment that we're facing? And I know that's a very easy question there. So Shilpan, why don't we toss it to you first?
You know, so there's been a lot of dialogue on, you know, what's happening in the trade wars and the potential for onshoring. What I would say is, you know, we've demonstrated a very strong crisis management. As I mentioned, you know, there's been no operations here in the US that have been affected by our suppliers' ability to run as the global pandemic was spreading and suppliers weren't able to produce in the locations around the world. We had a lot of protocols already put in place on how much inventory do we maintain stateside, how much material is on in transit between our global facilities, and then what production and inventory is kept at the suppliers. And it felt like it was the right balance, and we were able to manage through this situation with that. I think a lot of the dialogue now starts becoming into the business behind it. Obviously, if you start putting high tariffs, you know, that changes your financial planning for a supplier footprint and where the optimal footprint needs to occur. And so we'll continue to monitor that, and that's something you can adapt over time. But from a pandemic situation, I think it validated with some continuous improvements that we'll put in place on how to manage it from a crisis standpoint.
Okay. All right. Kathy, any thoughts there on trade and related complications?
You know, we monitor it very closely. We have a global supply base. We have a global footprint. We'll always make decisions that ensure we protect production. But again, we continue to monitor it and obviously continue to flow with the changes and the implementation of certain policies as they come into place.
Okay. Is there anywhere in the world that is a particular concern right now in terms of trade/sourcing uncertainty?
From my side, we monitor it very closely. I wouldn't say I have that as a high risk item. I think we have options and alternatives to where we're managing through that right now. So we have pretty good planning in place that it isn't one of my highest concerns.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, I think our ability to monitor and, you know, we believe we have adequate reaction time when these go in place, and, you know, it will become potentially a financial impact short term to give us time to adjust the footprint long term. But at this time, there isn't anything different we would need to do given the current state of the business.
Okay, got it. Yeah, you know, so the first ever MBS purchasing panel that I ran was 2008. And that was not the most optimistic environment, but on that panel, we had Bo Anderson as well. So we had the heads of purchasing for each of the Detroit three. It was a rather tough first time to do that. But, you know, over the years now, I've heard over and over again the concern that we as an industry get better at automaker supplier relationships and supplier to supplier relationships. And it's when a crisis comes along and our backs are against the wall, sometimes we lose that. Sometimes, you know, animosity or competitiveness kind of serves to endanger some of that progress that we've made. Now, are you seeing that now? Is there strain that's negatively impacting the relationships as we'd heard concerns about in prior crises?
So from my perspective, I see quite the opposite. Very collaborative, both within the OEs and within my supply base. You know, again, I continue to hear, we're in this together. This is so unique. This is so different as it relates to things that we're managing through. We're looking for, we all want to continue to make money. So we want to produce parts. We want to support each other. We want the OEs to continue to build product. So this is a very collaborative environment. We've established one-on-ones and more frequent communications with our supply base to ensure that we maintain this collaborative approach to it. Are there some tougher discussions? Yes, but more around you know, alternatives, and the OEs have been great as it relates to supporting us on some of these crisis situations, to where we need immediate reaction on alternative materials or alternative supply. But it's been nothing but an all-in from my perspective. Okay.
Kathy, would you say that we're doing a better job in this crisis as a result of the lessons that we learned in those prior crises?
I would say it would have to be. But the other crisis, again, was a little bit different than this one. I mean, this is so global. This truly does impact everybody. It isn't just about you have this, you know, certain percentage of automotive business and the other, you know, the other industries covering some of your financials, which may have been some of the prior cases. But regardless of what kind of industry you are in, you're impacted. Mm-hmm. So for the most part, you know, this is slightly different, but yes, I absolutely believe we have learned from the past. I think the automotive industry is very good at crisis management, quite honestly. And I think over the last few years, we've really become collaborative with, you know, a lot of supplier collaborations, and with the OEs, you know, the communication and those touch points are just much more frequent.
Got it. Yeah, and Shilpan, from your point of view, is there strain on the relationship, or is it, you know, one of those things that hard times actually bring us together sometimes?
Yeah, you know, I think 2008 was very humbling for us as an organization. Obviously, as we went through bankruptcy and saw the need to manage business in a different way, really focused around partnerships and collaboration. And, you know, what you've seen over that time frame, very proud of our progression and our supplier relationships. And, you know, we continue to lead all the domestic OEMs and building those relationships. And it's demonstrated, as Kathy mentioned, the level of collaboration we saw during this pandemic, not only from suppliers being comfortable and reaching out and talking to us about their concerns. But, you know, we knew it was going to be all about communications and transparency, and then what level of support we could provide each other. And so we immediately started putting together town halls and supplier business meetings, even if we didn't know what we were going to talk about, just to communicate that here's the stuff we're working on so everyone can plan accordingly, even if it wasn't fully vetted out. And I think that was helpful going through this. And at the same time, we found creative solutions from our suppliers and suggestions. And as I mentioned, not just for us, that helps the entire industry, that the suppliers were willing to share. You know, I've mentioned that Lear came out with their safety playbook very quickly, and we shared that across all suppliers so they could have it. I think one of the key areas that I saw this really come to light was when we decided that the country needed ventilators. And it was clear that this organization, StopTheSpread.org, had talked to many, many different industries with no one demonstrating the ability to react quickly enough to save lives. And so, you know, we decided we were going to pursue it. And within the first 48 hours, I had suppliers calling us, you know, basically giving me access to their entire resources, all their people, all their capital, all their facilities. What can we do to help? And it wasn't about, you know, how do we set up a business? How do we set up an agreement? How do we source the parts? It's let's all come together and figure out a solution. And that's what enabled us within 72 hours on hundreds of components, multi-thousands of subcomponents, very complex system, to find a plan to within 30 days to start producing ventilators and provide that to the hospitals that were in need. And I guess that really shows how we work collectively as an industry and as partnerships different than we had in the past.
Yeah, so, you know, to follow up on that, a question to you both, but Kathy, why don't we start with your perspective? How much harder was it to accomplish everything that we just talked about, given that you have to do it remotely, that you can't, you know, as easily go to someone's plant, or the fact that you can't sit down at a conference room table and work it all out in person as we're used to?
You know, we ensured that we had the tools that everybody needed to work from home. And from my perspective, it was almost seamless. Was it different? Yes. Did we recognize that, you know, initially everybody's joining these calls and there's no faces, no video, no anything. But everybody was okay with that in the beginning because, you know, we had all been working together for a while, and that was all about crisis management. One thing I did recognize is that, you know, as people started to work from home and maybe got uncomfortable with it, or, you know, maybe got in a different state of mind, just now turning on that video brought people back. So we were very aware of, you know, how effective we were from the home environment, but from an overall standpoint, it's been quite effective. You know, some would say that the meetings were longer maybe, or we had quite a, you know, it was quite a busy agenda throughout those first initial days, but I think that would have happened regardless. But from a standpoint of our effectiveness, we actually think we didn't skip a beat, and we continue to monitor how this is progressing over time. Again, I had mentioned that, you know, we want to make sure people don't get that, you know, that sustained, you know, looking at the same four walls all day, every day, and how do you re-engage them and how do you change things up a little bit? So we put a lot of time into ensuring that people are still okay and staying focused, and we have our priorities understood. But it all comes down to communication and making sure that what we're accountable for and what those expectations are met, and we stay the course. So from a standpoint of, you know, how have we seen that transition? It's been quite effective. It's different, no question, but it's been effective. Even with our suppliers, you know, we engage with them on video. If we ever need to see something within a manufacturing location, there's technology that allows us to see that. So we have used, you know, multiple tools to ensure that we maintain that collaboration and effectiveness.
Okay. Yeah, and so in addition to how it's made things more challenging to work within the company staff, how much is it an issue that, you know, you can't drive over to the Renaissance Center and meet with Chilpan, or you can't meet with his counterparts in person the same way that you could before?
You know, it's just different from maybe what we were used to in, you know, in this environment, because I could do it in the past, but quite honestly, we're a global company. We have telepresence all the
Right.
time. We are managing suppliers all around the globe. My peers are all around the globe. So it isn't anything that was really unique or new. It's just we have more of it.
Got it. Okay. Shilpan, how about from your point of view?
I think the benefits of how those relationships have gone over the time frame where with strong collaboration, there's been numerous visits to supplier facilities cross-functionally, and having a great understanding of the suppliers, their operations, and what decisions we make and how does it impact their facilities, whether it's schedule stability, mix changes. I think as we formed a crisis team internal of experts, especially in those areas that had the highest concern, having that deep understanding so we knew how we can support and help without physically being at a facility was key to help find those creative solutions. And there's a lot more tools in place today, just like this Zoom, where you can participate and feel like you're part of a dialogue, even if you're not there sitting there live. And there's some small adjustments made it, but I think it actually forces you to have a stronger focus on an intent and the ability to get it done efficiently so the team can move on and get back to their work.
Yeah, I have to say, personally, my last time being at the car offices was March 12th. And, at first, I'm used to a fair amount of travel and not being home a lot. And at first it drove me crazy. And it drove me crazy not to see my colleagues and have those in-person meetings. But it's amazing how you adapt, and now the idea of an MBS conference, for Pete's sake, here in my dining room, before this would have been unprecedented, but it's amazing how seamlessly we all sort of evolve into it. And I'm curious how much it's going to change things on the flip side when we hopefully ultimately recover from this, and maybe there'll be lessons from that, but I don't want to get into that because I'm saving that question for last.
But we do miss beautiful Traverse City, though.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I actually had a chance a couple of weeks, about a month ago, to be in Traverse City, and I walked through, this barren resort and that yellow tent, and it's a whole different vibe. But boy, it does kick in the nostalgia, I can tell you. All right. So speaking of how things might be different as a result of everything that we're confronting, one, were we by any chance running just a little too lean prior to this happening? Because initially when we think about how COVID hit, it was supply disruptions from China, and then, it kind of hit Europe and so on. But as the industry adapted to this evolving crisis, did it expose the fact that maybe we didn't have enough of a stockpile, that we didn't have enough at each level of the supply chain to protect us from something like this happening? Are we going to do things differently as a result, if that is in fact the case? Kathy, we haven't heard from you the longest. Why don't we throw this to you first?
So from my perspective, it allowed us to see a lot of things within our supply chain from a standpoint of managing our finished goods inventory and our raw material inventory different. I can debate whether we were possibly too lean in certain areas, but we also identified a lot of efficiencies. So, whether it be how we had some logistics lanes set up, whether it was, complexity and just the whole, value chain mapping, we actually identified a lot of areas of improvement, which is why we are actually proceeding with some IT solutions to ensure that we continue to find these opportunities. So from our standpoint, maybe there's areas that we should have been more lean and we were not. And we're working to address that, which helps us in our current financial state. And from a standpoint of just some efficiencies that we identified of loop back routes that didn't need to exist. I mean, when you really take that time, because we had to evaluate, that continuity plan, some things become more apparent that you weren't necessarily, completely aware of. So we're continuing to drive that efficiency within that end-to-end supply chain. And I think we'll have a different business model going forward, not necessarily totally different, but we'll be more lean coming out of this.
Okay. Yep. It's interesting to hear you say there will be more lean as opposed to less, because I'd heard, the counter argument as well. So I think that's a really nifty little thing that you just identified. Shilpan, what do you think?
Yeah, it's funny Kathy said that because that's actually one of the discussions we're having internal. We actually faced a double hurdle here when we went through the strike. And so our finished good inventory was rather thin. At the time, we just launched our new full-size truck and SUVs. And, you know, the demand for those vehicles as we were gaining share in the industry was outstanding. And you never want to leave a customer without a product that they're willing to buy. And so while we were lean coming into COVID, you know, the COVID just made us even more lean into the amount of inventory that we had on hand, and the critical state of being able to safely restart operations and accelerating, getting back to our volume that we need. You know, as we went through it, there were a lot of validations in the insurance policies that we put in place, as I mentioned, of how much inventory do you keep stateside, in transit, and at location of production. And sometimes those always come into question when, you know, you talk about the cost of inventory and the cost of obsolescence when you make changes. And it'd be easy to take those away because you never understand an insurance policy until you need to use it. And this was clearly the use of that insurance policy and demonstrated the strength of those protocols put in place. There were some elements that we thought, you know, we can make slight adjustments to, and you'll see us do that moving forward, especially domestically, which hit us a lot quicker when you don't have a pipeline put in place. But then it also identified those things that weren't turning quick, and those things that, you know, as we had to prioritize production and customers, those things from a complexity standpoint, we have the opportunity to take away because they don't turn as quick as those that are in high demand. And so you'll see a real focus on reducing the number of trim levels. So when we do build inventory, it's of those that turn at the quickest place.
And Bernard, when I mentioned that we're going to be more lean, it goes right back to what Shilpan just said, is we identified a lot of complexities. And we're working with our supply base to reduce that complexity, and we have proposals that we'd like to propose or get in front of our OE customers. That is the piece that you start to recognize the cost of a lot of that, and what it's driving from a logistics standpoint, from an inventory standpoint. And that's where I would say the opportunity to be more lean, it's come through us having to really get deep into our supply chain to recognize some of these things. So this is where we're looking at it as an opportunity as a go forward on how are we going to be better coming out of this?
Yeah, you know, I imagine those lessons are going to be very valuable because, you know, even just due to the economic impacts of the pandemic, we may not be selling as many vehicles, so therefore not building as many, even in a perfect environment. And therefore, we have to find a way to be profitable throughout the entire automotive value chain at whatever reduced volume we will end up at. And as we've mentioned in this discussion already, that's harder to predict in this environment than it ever, in all likelihood, has been before. We've got a number of questions here that tie back into the financial difficulty that parts of the supply chain and obviously automakers find themselves in. So maybe Shilpan, starting with you, can you talk a little bit about what you've seen in terms of the supply base having financial problems that, you know, one, impact their ability to continue to be a steady source of supply. And also, quite interestingly, you know, the unique element of this crisis is that we stopped producing for X amount, and that restart had to be industry-wide and different from anything we faced before. So from that point of view, I'm wondering if you could also talk about the difficulty of what it took to execute that restart, given that we had financially strained suppliers who hadn't received any checks from their automaker customers for a while, who still needed the resources to turn those plants back on. So why don't we start it with you, Shilpan?
You know, I mentioned early on, we created this premise tree around what must be true for us to ensure continued operations. And, you know, beyond the initial, how do we safely bring operations at our supply base up and running, ensure they have adequate capacity and, you know, employees to return to build at volume. The next big one is the financial health, and not knowing how long this was going to last, as we all were trying to manage through our liquidity. we were lucky that, different from 2008, the financial markets were still healthy, the banks were still healthy, access to capital was still available, which was a big benefit to the industry. And getting back to the communications, the first thing we did was we started sharing all the austerity measures that we were putting in place to protect the company, to sustain an extended impact of the COVID situation. And we asked the suppliers to do the same. We were working with federal governments around the world to identify how sensitive the automotive industry was and the need to help support to make sure that the industry is sustainable and can come out of this effectively. And you saw a lot of stimulus packages come out that were automotive focused, and we immediately put teams in place to connect our supply base to that available funding. And then we put in place, actually prior to COVID, late last year, an early payment program where you could factor on your receivables to get the cash flow at an accelerated pace through Wells Fargo. And we actually shared that as we saw the industry more broadly and getting feedback from some of the industry leads on the need to provide support. So we actually helped communicate and support other OEMs that have put that in place since then on how to create that system for early payment programs. We continue to monitor, the financial health of our suppliers and our health, and how do we collectively find a path forward, to rebuild what, we managed through the first wave of this COVID. We all came out of it, albeit, with very thin liquidity available, very thin pipelines available. All those insurance policies I mentioned are scarce at this point because we haven't had the ability to reestablish those. And so, we're even more closely monitoring the current impacts to our suppliers and the potential second wave.
Okay. All right. Kathy, you're in a point of view of being a tier one. So, you're also very reliant on those lower tiers as part of your value chain. How did it look and how does it look from your point of view?
Started 2020 in a very different situation as far as we have a very proactive financial health risk monitoring that we do of our supply base. So as we go through these next few months, we're sitting here with the list of high-risk suppliers to where we proactively work that contingency plan. But what's ahead of us and what we're really prioritizing is that we have, a number of suppliers that are in that mid-risk point. And from a standpoint of what do the next few months look like, those could really turn them one way or another. So from a standpoint of what does it look like right now, we're currently managing a bankruptcy right now. And going back to the topic of really this discussion is the supplier relationships, the OE relationships. We were able to move tools within 24 hours. We have aligned suppliers that were ready to swoop in and support us in this, in these very, in that very difficult, challenging type of environment where you have, closed doors. So we have quite a bit of proactive monitoring of that complete supply base. And I would say that, in our opinion, we feel that these next few months are going to be even more critical than the last three, that last 3 to 4. So we continue to have that as one of our top priorities, and to ensure that we're working collaboratively with the OEs on what alternatives that we've identified, that in the event something were to happen, we are prepared. It's a high focus here.
Right. And Kathy, you mentioned having a number of suppliers that are kind of on the bubble. They're at that midway point. Can you provide some indication just directionally over the last few weeks? Are more sort of moving in the healthy direction of that spectrum, or are more struggling?
In the last month, it's been pretty stable. So we had a spike coming into June, then it's stabilized. So just predicting how the next few months are going to go as it relates to our continuity of supply and keeping plants running, that's really where we're watching what the forecasts look like by OE, what suppliers are impacted by OE, so that we can try to do kind of what Shilpan mentioned, that white space of where do we see that risk? What is that contingency? How do we plan accordingly? We're seeing a lot coming out of Europe, and we haven't seen as much here in the US, but that's kind of how we're managing our plan, is what does that white space look like? And again, our priority as far as where we see risks, it's really going to be these next few months. Where are these hot spots of the COVID for those suppliers in Mexico, what is the ramifications of what could be some issues here over the next few months. So like I'd mentioned, it's a top priority, and we put a lot of effort into ensuring that we have contingency plans in place and utilizing our global supply base.
Right. And I imagine, and Shilpan, we'll start with you, but I imagine it helps, that as an industry, we're running a lot leaner now than we, for example, were in 2008. We had such an amount of excess capacity in the industry in those days that it really kind of came back to bite us when things got hard. How much easier, if that word can even be used, is this crisis to navigate? Just because we are a leaner industry without that same degree of overcapacity that was there before.
Yeah, I think we never let a crisis go by without the opportunity to improve the business and find the path to more efficiency. And, you've heard us talk a bit about the level of complexity still built in. So there's still opportunities to be more lean. And when we talk about the transition of the automotive industry into the next generation, and how do we manage through that through very efficient use of capital, making sure we have the right level of capacity put in, and how do we produce where we're all running at high utilization. All those factors continue to play a factor as we move forward. One of the things we know is to be able to move forward, we've got to rebuild everyone's liquidity and rebuild those balance sheets. And so what we continue to reinforce is we did a great job of putting the safety protocols in place. If you actually look at the measurement, not just at our OEMs, but at our suppliers, of the capability of those safety protocols to keep people safe and prevent the spread of COVID in the facilities in which we all operate, it's more effective than anything we've seen in any other industry. And so we've been demonstrating that data to governments around the world to really share that we truly believe people are more safe in our automotive facilities than in general public. So we can keep automotive essential, and knowing that we're keeping people safe, keeping the health of the industry moving forward. And I think that becomes critical for all of us to continue to reinforce and hold governance to, so if a second wave were to occur, we could all sustain through that.
Got it. Yeah, and Kathy, in terms of that different capacity scenario, any thoughts from you on how it's not the way that it was in 2008, for example, but pick any other crisis versus today?
The sustainability of capacity is what you're saying, that how we utilize our capacity, or?
Yeah, that, and we don't have the same overhead that we did before, right? We don't have quite as much unused capacity. And then when the crisis hits, there's even that much more to contend.
Correct. So this kind of goes into, we've identified those inefficiencies, and how do we get more lean out of this? How do we consolidate our business under certain suppliers? Our supplier consolidation efforts, how do we better utilize our spend with our healthy suppliers and utilize that capacity in a different way? And again, our global footprint as well.
Okay.
And from a Yazaki standpoint, we continue to reevaluate our manufacturing footprint as well.
Got it. Yeah. All right. So we are getting close to the end of our time. So I want to finish on a more optimistic question, right? Because I think that might be a nice touch for a panel that really deals pretty heavily with the pandemic and a lot of heavy subject matter. So now, that we've been through this and we've learned a lot, we've had a whole lot of improvements and lessons learned. What will permanently be better as a result of having undergone this when we do in fact emerge from it? And Shilpan, why don't we throw it to you first?
Yes, I think two big things. One, we were a bit reactive to addressing the pandemic as it spread around the world. If you look back, we probably could have forecasted it earlier and put protocols in place to ensure essential status earlier. And then even from a country and ability to manage a COVID situation with the lack of available personal protection equipment and ventilators, we were reactive to it. And while we all stepped up and helped contribute to ensure it wasn't having a significant impact to the country and the health of the industry, it's not something we want to continue to do, in that being reactive. And So the necessity of being proactive, even before you realize there's a problem to be faced, is really critical in how we'll move the business forward. And whether it's our acceleration of the conversion to an all-electric future, and you'll see more come out with that. You'll see later this week the reveal of the Cadillac Lyriq. But also when we talk about climate change, and Dane Parker shared this morning, you know, our stance at General Motors of believing climate change is real. And what we need to do collectively with the supply base is proactively put those means in place so we can ensure we address that and drive really all sustainable content and a net carbon-free value stream in our operations. And then the second big thing, and obviously a topic in the nation, was the importance of having diversity of thoughts, ideas, and perspectives. And when we look at how we were able to manage this global pandemic, as situations were happening around the world, and the ability to have a team around the world that have those established relationships, understand how solutions work around the world, and collectively coming together to share those solutions, come up with creative ideas, and finding a plan forward. It even shows more critically why that inclusion is necessary and why General Motors will be the most inclusive company in the world.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Kathy, why don't we turn it over to you? What are we going to do better, you know, but maybe even as an industry, as a result of what we're learning here during these trying times?
So what I think will be better and just, you know, continued progress is that we will be moving into new technologies, and the way that everybody threw themselves into the ventilators. I mean, suppliers wanted to be a part of that. Everybody wanted, and it wasn't about automotive and running plants. It was about doing what's right for people. So I think we're prioritizing people. And I think that's critically important, especially with everything going on, is what is that diversification? What is that inclusiveness? And how do we collaborate to be successful from an economic standpoint? So I think that's really front and center. And then how do you proceed to build that business structure with collaboration? So we had to collaborate to get into this new technology, but I think what we have demonstrated is that we mutually want to be successful. We mutually need each other. We need to recognize that as people, we need to look at things differently, and that we need to ensure that those changes are part of our culture within our companies. So I think just bringing that more to everyone's awareness is going to make us you know, a better, more collaborative and moving forward with solidarity. I truly believe that.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear, because it appears it's almost guaranteed. You know, it may be a decade, it may be more, but somewhere, somehow, there will be another crisis, and it's good to hear that we'll be just that bit better prepared for it when it does hit. With that, Kathy Schilpan, I'd like to say thank you very much. It's been a fantastic conversation, and I think we could fill another hour here pretty easily, because it'd be great to keep going. But I'd just like to say thank you again for making the time available for us, and for your honesty, and then the great content that you have provided to our viewers. And before we wrap up, I'd like to thank Warner Norcross and Judd for sponsoring this session. Invite all of our participants to tune in for what's next. We've got a great day point something here coming up for you in MBS 2020. So again, everyone, thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.